There's a portrait in London's National Portrait Gallery. Queen Victoria, draped in royal silk, holding her scepter, the picture of dignity, the grandmother of Europe, the face of civilization itself. Millions of tourists walk past it every year, pausing to admire the woman who defined an era. But if you could see what I'm about to show you, you'd never look at that painting the same way again. Because beneath all that Victorian morality, beneath the tea parties and the proper manners and the civilizing mission, the British Empire was running the largest drug trafficking operation in human history. And when someone tried to stop them, they sent warships, they burned cities, they forced an entire civilization to its knees. This is the story of how a respectable government became a criminal enterprise, how tea addiction led to mass narcotics trafficking, and how the trauma of these events still shapes the world we live in today. Walk into any British school today and ask them about the Opium Wars. Most students will give you a blank stare. Maybe they'll remember something vague about trade disputes. Perhaps they recall the name Hong Kong mentioned in passing. But the full story, the uncomfortable truth, you won't find it prominently featured at Eton or Oxford. It doesn't appear in the nostalgic period dramas about the royal family. The image of British warships systematically destroying Chinese coastal defenses to protect drug smugglers has been carefully airbrushed from the Western consciousness. It's been sanitized, minimized, forgotten. For the British, it's an embarrassing footnote, a regrettable lapse in judgment during an otherwise glorious era. For the Chinese, it's the wound that never healed, the beginning of what they call the century of humiliation. But for the men who made the decisions, the traders in their counting houses, the officials in their government offices, the politicians in Parliament, this wasn't about malice or evil. It was about economics. It was about survival. The British Empire ran on money, and by the 1830s, that engine was sputtering toward bankruptcy. To understand how Britain transformed into a drug cartel, you have to understand their pathological obsession with tea. This wasn't a casual preference. This was a national addiction. By the early 1800s, tea had become woven into the fabric of British identity. The average British citizen consumed over 2 pounds of tea per year, more than any other nation on earth. Tea fueled the Industrial Revolution. In the dark, satanic mills of Manchester and Birmingham, workers toiled 14-hour shifts in conditions we'd consider inhumane today. The only thing that made those brutal hours bearable? Tea breaks. Hot, sweet tea that provided a momentary escape and just enough energy to keep going. The aristocracy had their elaborate tea ceremonies, delicate porcelain cups, silver spoons, precise etiquette. Tea wasn't just refreshment, it was social currency, status, civilization itself. And the British government, they were completely dependent on tea revenue. Import duties on tea provided the funds to build battleships, pay civil servants, and maintain the vast machinery of empire. Tea taxes were so crucial that they represented a significant portion of government income. But there was one catastrophic problem at the heart of this entire system. Tea only grew in one place, China, and the Qing emperor who sat on the dragon throne in Beijing. He had absolutely no interest in anything Britain had to offer. The British tried everything to balance their trade. They offered fine British wool. The emperor's response? His people wore silk, softer, more elegant. They presented mechanical clocks and scientific instruments. The Chinese had been building sophisticated astronomical devices for centuries. They showcased military technology. The Middle Kingdom had invented gunpowder. The emperor's message was clear and unwavering. The Celestial Empire possesses all things in abundance. We have no need for your manufactures. If you wish to purchase our tea, you will pay in silver." And that's exactly what Britain did. For decades, British ships made the long voyage to Canton loaded with millions of ounces of silver bullion. They docked, they unloaded their precious metal, and they sailed back with nothing but crates of dried leaves that would be boiled and consumed. The trade imbalance wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Britain was hemorrhaging its wealth at an unsustainable rate. Silver reserves were draining from the Bank of England. The currency was destabilizing. Economists warned of impending disaster. The directors of the East India Company, the mega-corporation that effectively ran Britain's Asian trade, stared at their balance sheets with growing horror. If they didn't reverse this flow of silver, and soon, the empire would collapse under its own debt. They needed a product the Chinese couldn't refuse, a commodity that would bypass the rational logic of the market and tap into something deeper, darker, the biological compulsions of human addiction. They found it growing in the fields of India. Opium. The production of opium wasn't left to chaotic criminal networks or independent smugglers. This was organized with the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of a government ministry. The British didn't just allow opium cultivation, they engineered it. In the fertile plains of the Bengal Presidency, the British colonial administration established a state monopoly that would make modern drug cartels look amateurish by comparison. They forced tens of thousands of Indian farmers to abandon their traditional crops, the wheat, rice, and vegetables that fed their families, and plant vast fields of opium poppies instead. These weren't voluntary arrangements. British controlled the land through a complex system of taxation and legal coercion. Farmers who resisted faced penalties. Those who complied received fixed prices that kept them perpetually indebted. The processing facilities at Patna and Ghazipur were unlike anything the world had seen. They were industrial cathedrals dedicated to the refinement of narcotics. Contemporary accounts from British officials and visitors paint an almost surreal picture. In the Great Hall of the Ghazipur factory, visitors described seeing thousands of earthen jars stacked from floor to ceiling, each one brimming with thick, black opium paste that glistened in the dim light. The smell was overwhelming, sickeningly sweet and heavy, clinging to clothes and hair, an odor that hung over the entire district, announcing from miles away what was produced there. Inside these facilities, armies of local workers spent their days literally immersed in the drug. They stood waist-deep in massive vats, churning the opium with long paddles to ensure consistent potency. The heat was oppressive, the fumes intoxicating. Workers often became addicted simply through exposure, their skin absorbing the drug as they labored. This was the genius, if you can call it that, of the British system. They took the techniques of the Industrial Revolution, the standardization, the quality control, the mass production, and applied them to illegal narcotics. Every opium ball was precisely weighed and shaped to the same specifications. Each cake was stamped with the official seal of the East India Company, the same mark that appeared on legitimate trade goods: gold bars, rifle crates, tea chests. This wasn't contraband in the traditional sense. This was a product of the state, manufactured in government facilities with government oversight, generating government revenue. But there remained one delicate problem. Selling opium in China was strictly illegal under Qing law. The penalty for trafficking wasn't prison, it was death by strangulation. The British government couldn't be seen directly violating the laws of a sovereign nation, not if they wanted to maintain their reputation as a civilized, law-abiding power. So they created a system of plausible deniability that was as cynical as it was effective. a legal shell game that would impress modern corporate lawyers. Here's how it worked. The East India Company manufactured the opium in India, perfectly legal on British territory. They held public auctions in Calcutta, where private traders could purchase the drug, again, technically legal. The company collected revenue from these sales and washed their hands of what happened next. The private traders who bought the opium became the smugglers. They were the ones who would face the risk, carry the liability, and reap the enormous profits from the illegal Chinese trade. The British government could claim, with carefully maintained innocence, that they had no control over what private citizens chose to do after purchasing a legal product. The king of these smugglers was a man named William Jardine, a Scottish doctor who'd abandoned medicine for more lucrative pursuits. Jardine possessed a brilliant mind for logistics and finance, and an apparent vacancy where his moral compass should have been. Jardine and his partners, men like James Matheson, bought government opium by the ton. They loaded it onto fast clipper ships, specially designed for smuggling. These vessels were armed with cannons and crewed by men willing to fight Chinese authorities if necessary. They sailed south to the Pearl River Delta, to the waters off Guangdong province. There, they anchored off remote islands like Linton, turning their ships into floating warehouses. These vessels never touched Chinese ports. They never technically entered Chinese territory. Instead, they sat in international waters, while smaller Chinese boats, operated by local smugglers the British had recruited, ferried the opium ashore. Jardine and his competitors built an elaborate distribution network. They bribed local officials, offering silver that desperate magistrates found hard to refuse. They armed local gangs, creating private security forces to protect their operations. They established relationships with Chinese merchants who handled the inland distribution. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that moved poison from British decks, through Chinese middlemen, into the veins of millions of Chinese people. And the silver? The silver that Britain had been bleeding to China for decades? It came flooding back. The trade deficit that had threatened to bankrupt the empire? Fixed. The drain on the Bank of England's reserves? Reversed. The empire's financial crisis? Solved. The cost was merely the slow-motion destruction of the world's oldest continuous civilization. By 1838, the British were smuggling 40,000 chests of opium into China every year. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of the drug. Do the math. That's approximately 5 million pounds of pure narcotic flooding into China annually. The impact wasn't gradual. It was apocalyptic. Chinese officials wrote desperate reports describing the social devastation. Entire villages where productive farmland lay fallow because the men had stopped working. They spent their days on wooden pallets in dim opium dens, pipes in hand, slowly destroying themselves with each breath of smoke. Families were torn apart. Men sold their possessions, furniture, tools, even their children, to feed their addiction. Women became widows to husbands who were still technically alive, but utterly lost to the drug. The Chinese military, once formidable, rotted from within. Soldiers sold their muskets, weapons meant to defend the empire, to buy opium. Officers showed up to duty already intoxicated, unable to lead or plan. Military discipline, cultivated over centuries, simply evaporated. The bureaucracy that had governed China for thousands of years ground to a halt. Magistrates, meant to dispense justice and maintain order, arrived at court already high. They made irrational decisions, fell asleep during proceedings, or simply failed to appear at all. But perhaps most devastating was the economic impact. The silver that powered China's economy, the metal that served as the basis of their currency, the medium of all major transactions, was vanishing at an alarming rate. As silver flowed out to pay for opium, prices inflated catastrophically. The peasantry, paid in copper coins tied to silver value, found their wages worth less and less. Taxes became impossible to pay. Debts spiraled. The economic instability triggered famines, sparked rebellions, and destabilized regions that had been peaceful for generations. The Qing Emperor Daoguang watched his empire crumble in real time. Not from a foreign army marching across his borders, not from internal rebellion or natural disaster, but from an invasion of addiction facilitated by British merchants. He realized with growing horror that this was an existential threat. If the opium flow wasn't stopped, and stopped soon, China would cease to exist as a functioning state. He needed someone incorruptible, someone who couldn't be bribed, intimidated, or swayed by the massive financial interests involved. He needed a man of absolute integrity. Enter Lin Zexu, a scholar official from Fujian province, educated in the Confucian classics, renowned for his administrative skill. They called him Blue Sky Lin, a poetic way of saying his integrity was as clear and unblemished as the heavens. The emperor summoned Lin to the Forbidden City. He presented him with a ceremonial sword, a symbol of the emperor's authority, and he gave him a mandate that was brutally simple. Destroy the Yashe opium trade. Use whatever means necessary. March 1839, journey to Canton. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton, the epicenter of the trade, in March 1839. He didn't come to negotiate, he didn't come to compromise, he came to annihilate the entire criminal network. Lin launched a crackdown that was breathtaking in its speed and severity. He arrested thousands of Chinese dealers and threw them into prison. He rounded up tens of thousands of addicts and forced them into rehabilitation centers, facilities where withdrawal was supervised with a mixture of traditional medicine and brutal discipline. The choice given to addicts was stark: break the habit or face execution. It was harsh, it was draconian, but Lin believed he was fighting for China's survival, and in war, mercy is a luxury. But Lin understood something crucial. Arresting Chinese victims wasn't enough. As long as British ships sat offshore pumping opium into the country, the problem would never end. He had to cut off the head of the snake. He had to confront the British Empire itself. Lin issued an ultimatum to the foreign merchants living in the wealthy enclave known as the 13 Factories, a privileged district where Westerners conducted their trade under special protections. His demands were non-negotiable. Hand over every ounce of opium in your possession. Sign a bond promising never to smuggle the drug again. Accept that violators would be subject to Chinese law, including the death penalty. The British merchants tried to stall, expecting Lin to back down like previous Chinese officials who could be bribed or intimidated. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. When the merchants refused to comply immediately, Lin showed them what a sovereign power looks like when pushed past its breaking point. He deployed troops to completely surround the foreign quarter, built wooden barricades across every street leading in or out, cut off all food and water supplies to the compound, ordered his soldiers to beat drums and gongs throughout the night, the constant noise denying the merchants sleep, wearing down their resistance through exhaustion. He transformed their luxurious trading post into a prison. The British merchants found themselves trapped, unable to leave, unable to resupply, unable to communicate with the outside world. Days passed, then weeks. The siege held firm. Captain Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade and the highest-ranking British official in Canton, realized he had no good options. Fearing for the lives of British subjects under his protection, Elliot made a decision. He ordered the merchants to surrender their opium stock. All of it. Every chest. Every ounce. And he made them a promise. The British government, the Queen herself, would reimburse them for their losses. Every penny would be repaid. It was essentially a promissory note backed by the British Treasury, a promise that would have enormous consequences. Lin Zexu had won. He seized over 20,000 chests of British opium, a mountain of drugs worth millions of pounds sterling, enough poison to keep the entire population of China intoxicated for months. Now came the question, what to do with it? Lin didn't consider selling the opium to recoup losses for the Chinese government. He didn't think about repurposing it for medicinal use. He wanted it destroyed, completely, publicly, and symbolically. He ordered 3 massive trenches dug on the beach at Human, near the mouth of the Pearl River. Each trench was enormous, deep enough that workers could stand inside them. The destruction began on June 3rd, 1839. It was a public spectacle, a statement. Workers crushed the opium balls into paste. They threw the paste into the trenches. Then they added lime, salt, and seawater, creating a chemical reaction that caused the mixture to boil and sizzle. The air filled with acrid smoke and the sickeningly sweet smell of burning opium. The heat was intense, the fumes overwhelming. Workers labored in shifts, covering their faces with cloth, stirring the toxic brew with long poles. They watched as millions of pounds worth of narcotics turned into useless, poisonous sludge. At low tide, Lin ordered the sluice gates opened. The contaminated mixture flowed into the sea, dispersing with the current. The destruction took 23 days to complete. 3 weeks of continuous work to eliminate the poison. While workers stirred the boiling pits under the summer sun, Lin Zexu sat in his tent and composed a letter. Not to the British government, not to their diplomats, but to Queen Victoria herself. He didn't write as a barbarian to a civilized monarch, the condescending dynamic Europeans assumed. He wrote as one person of moral conscience to another, as one ruler to another, as one human being to another. His central question has echoed through history. I have heard that in your honorable nation, the smoking of opium is strictly forbidden. If it is forbidden in your land because of its harm, then how can you bear to allow it to be carried to other countries where it poisons the people? He appealed to her humanity, to her Christian values, to her reputation as a benevolent monarch. He assumed, naively, tragically, that she simply didn't know what was being done in her name. He believed that if the Queen of England understood the full truth, if she knew that British merchants were destroying an entire civilization for profit, she would immediately order it stopped. The letter was carefully translated, properly addressed, and sent through official channels. It was never answered. We don't know if Queen Victoria ever personally saw it. It likely gathered dust in a pigeonhole at the Foreign Office, dismissed by bureaucrats as the complaints of an inferior power. But even if she had, she read it, even if it had reached her hands, and she'd carefully considered every word. It wouldn't have changed what came next. Because in London, the destruction of the opium was not seen as a righteous act of law enforcement by a sovereign nation protecting its people. It was seen as theft, an intolerable violation of British property rights, an insult that demanded retribution. When news of the opium destruction reached London in the autumn of 1839, the drug dealers didn't slink into the shadows. They didn't hide in shame or quietly accept their losses. They went on the offensive. William Jardine, the iron-headed old rat, as the Chinese called him, travelled back to London, and he launched a lobbying campaign that would make modern pharmaceutical companies and defence contractors look like amateurs. Jardine had connections. Money opens doors, and he had vast amounts of it. He secured meetings with Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, one of the most powerful men in the British government. Jardine didn't present himself as a drug smuggler defending his criminal profits. He reframed the entire narrative. He unfolded detailed maps of the Chinese coast across Palmerston's desk, pointed to deep water harbors, strategic positions, defenseless cities. His arguments were brilliantly crafted. The Chinese have insulted the British flag and violated diplomatic norms. They've destroyed private property worth millions, property that British merchants acquired legally under British law. They've imprisoned British subjects without trial. They've violated the sacred principles of free trade that Britain champions. And militarily, they're weak, pathetically so, armed with bows, arrows, and outdated matchlock muskets. A small fleet of modern warships could bring the entire Celestial Empire to its knees in a matter of weeks, possibly days. But Jardine's most persuasive argument was economic. The Chinese trade generates enormous revenue for Britain. Tea taxes alone support a significant portion of government operations. If we allow the Chinese to dictate terms, to destroy British property with impunity, we signal weakness to every other nation. Trade routes become uncertain. British prestige suffers. But a swift military response? It would secure favorable terms for decades, open Chinese ports to British trade, establish permanent bases, ensure the free flow of commerce. Lord Palmerston listened to all of this, and he did his own calculations. The British government was financially strained. They needed the tea tax revenue desperately. British merchants, legitimate constituents, were demanding compensation for destroyed property totaling over $20 million. Where would that money come from? The choice was stark. Accept the loss, respect Chinese sovereignty, and admit that British power has limits. Or go to war, force China to pay compensation, and extract favorable trade terms through military force. For Lord Palmerston, for the British cabinet, for Queen Victoria's government, it wasn't really a choice at all. They chose war. They would make China pay for the drugs that Chinese authorities had destroyed while enforcing Chinese law on Chinese territory, and they would dress it up in the language of free trade and diplomatic insult. They would call it the defense of British honor. But everyone involved knew what it really was: a war to protect drug smugglers and force a sovereign nation to accept the poisoning of its people. The expedition that sailed from India to China in the summer of 1840 was more than just a military operation. It was the Industrial Revolution weaponized. It was a glimpse of the future of warfare. It was modernity itself, armed and angry, descending on a civilization that had remained fundamentally unchanged for centuries. At the head of this armada sailed a ship that would haunt Chinese nightmares for generations, the HMS Nemesis. The Nemesis was a revolution in naval design, the first ocean-going iron warship in history. Its hull wasn't wood, it was riveted iron plates that could deflect cannonballs that would shatter wooden ships. It was powered by steam engines, paddles churning the water, allowing it to sail against wind and tide, to maneuver in ways sailing ships never could. Most crucially, it could navigate up shallow rivers where traditional ships of the line couldn't go. It mounted modern rifled cannon that could hit targets with devastating accuracy at ranges Chinese guns couldn't match. It carried Congreve rockets, explosive projectiles that screamed through the air like falling stars. To Chinese defenders watching this iron monster approach their coast, belching black smoke, moving against the wind, it must have seemed like something from a nightmare. A demon vessel, a dragon made of metal. China's navy, once the most advanced in the Ohuai world, had stagnated. Their fleet consisted of wooden junks, beautiful in their construction, but centuries behind in military technology, powered by sail and oar, armed with smooth-bore cannons that hadn't changed significantly since the Ming dynasty 3 centuries earlier. The collision between these two forces wasn't a battle. It was barely even a fight. It was an execution. The British didn't attempt to conquer China's vast interior. That would be impossible. They didn't need to occupy the country. They just needed to strangle it. They sailed methodically up the Chinese coast, bombarded coastal forts into rubble, seized key ports and harbors, cut off trade routes and supply lines. Most devastatingly, they captured the tax barges on the Grand Canal, the vessels that carried grain tribute from the fertile south to Beijing. By threatening the capital with starvation, they put pressure directly on the emperor. The Chinese defenders were incredibly brave, generals who had spent their entire lives studying classical military texts, soldiers willing to die for their emperor and their homeland. But bravery meant nothing against the technological gap. Chinese cannonballs, when they managed to hit the iron-hulled nemesis, bounced harmlessly off its sides or left superficial dents. Their wooden war junks were set ablaze by Congreve rockets, incendiary projectiles that turned beautiful vessels into floating infernos within minutes. British officers wrote letters home, describing scenes that filled them with a mixture of awe and pity. They watched Chinese soldiers stand their ground amid hailstorms of grape shot, firing their matchlock muskets, reloading with desperate speed, until they were simply cut down where they stood. It was medieval courage meeting industrial age firepower, the clash between an ancient civilization and the modern world, and the modern world had absolutely no mercy. Chinese casualties numbered in the thousands. British casualties? Dozens. Sometimes single digits in major engagements. It wasn't warfare in any traditional sense. It was slaughter enabled by technological superiority. As British forces moved north, they left a trail of burning cities, shattered fortifications, and broken bodies. In Beijing, the Qing Emperor Daoguang was paralyzed by shock and disbelief. He could not comprehend how a handful of foreigners from a small island on the other side of the world could dismantle the defenses of the Middle Kingdom with such contemptuous ease. But the British weren't interested in the emperor's confusion or his attempts to understand. They were interested in only one thing: his complete submission. By the summer of 1842, the British fleet had sailed up the Yangtze River, deep into the heart of China. They positioned their iron warships with guns trained on the ancient city of Nanjing. The message was clear: surrender or watch the city burn. The emperor faced an impossible decision: continue fighting a war he couldn't win, watching his empire and people be destroyed, or capitulate to humiliating demands from foreign barbarians. Faced with the annihilation of his people and the potential collapse of his dynasty, Emperor Daoguang surrendered. On August 29, 1842, Chinese officials in elaborate silk robes boarded the British flagship, the HMS Cornwallis. Under the literal shadow of British naval guns, they signed the Treaty of Nanking. In China, this document is known as the first of the unequal treaties, a series of imposed agreements that would strip China of sovereignty for over a century. It's a document of profound national humiliation that still shapes Chinese consciousness today. The British dictated every term. China must pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, an astronomical sum. 6 million of those dollars were specifically designated to compensate British merchants for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed. Think about the audacity of that for a moment. Britain invaded China, killed thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians, destroyed Chinese forts and cities, and then forced China to pay for the privilege, including reimbursement for the illegal drugs that Chinese authorities had confiscated while enforcing Chinese law on Chinese territory. It would be like a modern nation invading another country to protect drug smugglers, then forcing the invaded nation to compensate the drug dealers for their destroyed merchandise. A gangster protection racket executed on the stage of international diplomacy. But money was only part of the extortion. The treaty forced China to open 5 treaty ports, cities where British merchants could live, trade, and establish communities without being subject to Chinese law. British subjects in these ports would be governed by British law, not Chinese law. If a British citizen committed a crime, even murder, Chinese authorities had no jurisdiction. They could not arrest, try, or punish British nationals. It was a complete violation of Chinese sovereignty in their own territory. And most fatefully, most consequentially, the treaty